When Beijing first unveiled its sweeping controls on rare earth mineral exports, alarm bells rang across Western capitals. What followed was a months-long scramble that exposed just how dependent the world's most powerful economies have become on China's grip over these critical materials. For nearly half a year, American imports of rare earth elements from China essentially flatlined, dropping to levels so low they might as well have been zero. The consequences rippled through industries that form the backbone of American technological and military power. Defense contractors building the next generation of fighter jets, automakers racing to dominate the electric vehicle market, and manufacturers producing everything from smartphones to wind turbines. Washington's response revealed the depth of its desperation. American officials launched a two-pronged strategy, quietly attempting to source these materials through indirect channels involving third-party nations, while simultaneously opening high-stakes negotiations with Beijing to restore the supply chain that had been severed. The price of restoring access? The United States offered meaningful compromises, relaxing certain restrictions on advanced semiconductor exports and reducing some of the tariff barriers that had been erected between the two nations. The strategy appeared to work. By June, something remarkable happened. China's rare earth shipments to the United States exploded by 660% compared to previous months, delivering 353 tons of these precious materials across the Pacific. The volume itself was modest, barely a fraction of what American industries truly needed, but the symbolism was enormous. For the first time that year, Chinese rare earths were flowing back into American factories and laboratories. Just as tensions seemed to be easing and both sides appeared ready to find common ground, Washington made a move that Beijing viewed as nothing short of betrayal. During ongoing trade discussions, American negotiators suddenly introduced a new demand that hadn't been part of the original framework. China must immediately cease all oil purchases from Russia and Iran. To enforce this ultimatum, the United States threatened to weaponize secondary sanctions against Chinese companies engaged in this trade, warning that non-compliance could trigger tariffs as high as 100% on Chinese goods. The timing couldn't have been more provocative. After months of painstaking negotiations and carefully calibrated concessions on both sides, this unexpected demand felt like a complete reversal, a diplomatic ambush that threatened to unravel everything that had been achieved. This raises crucial questions that will shape the global economy for years to come. Why is Washington so fixated on controlling Beijing's energy partnerships with Moscow and Tehran? And more importantly, will China bend to this pressure, or does it have the leverage and resolve to chart its own course regardless of American threats? If you're interested in understanding the high-stakes economic and geopolitical battles reshaping our world, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our in-depth analysis of these critical issues. Now, let's dive deep into this unfolding drama. The weapon nobody saw coming. To understand how we arrived at this impasse, we need to rewind to July of last year, when Beijing first began tightening its control over strategic mineral exports. The initial restrictions targeted gallium, germanium, and graphite, materials that sound obscure but are absolutely essential for cutting-edge technology and military applications. By April of this year, those controls had expanded dramatically to encompass 7 distinct categories of critical materials. China's stated rationale was straightforward and, on the surface, reasonable. These restrictions were designed to prevent sensitive resources from being diverted into military programs that could potentially be used against Chinese interests. Under the new regulatory framework, any company wanting to export these materials must navigate a licensing process that includes submitting detailed documentation proving the intended civilian end use of every shipment. Here's where geopolitics enters the equation. While the licensing process moves relatively quickly for nations that maintain friendly relations with Beijing, applications from countries with more contentious relationships face significantly longer processing times and more intensive scrutiny. It's a system that rewards diplomatic cooperation and punishes adversarial postures. Predictably, this approach sparked immediate backlash. Numerous Western governments accused China of weaponizing rare earth materials, using control over critical resources as leverage in broader geopolitical conflicts. The criticism highlighted a fundamental irony. Western nations had long controlled exports of advanced technology and strategic materials to China through various export control regimes, yet they viewed China's adoption of similar strategies as uniquely problematic. Over the subsequent months, anxiety about potential shortages intensified across multiple continents. But no country felt the squeeze quite like the United States, which had built its high-tech industries on a foundation of Chinese rare earth imports. The numbers tell a sobering story. Before these restrictions took effect, the United States relied on China for approximately 80% of its rare earth requirements, a dependence that left American supply chains acutely vulnerable to any disruption. When Beijing activated its export controls, the impact was swift and severe. Between March and May, American rare earth imports from China collapsed by more than 75%, creating immediate shortages across multiple industrial sectors. The ripple effects spread quickly through America's most strategically important industries. Particular concerns centered on dysprosium and terbium, two elements that sound like they belong in science fiction but are absolutely critical for modern technology. These materials are essential components in everything from the F-35 Lightning II fighter jet, America's most advanced stealth aircraft, to Tesla's electric vehicle motors and the generators inside massive wind turbines. Facing what many industry insiders were calling an emerging crisis, Washington scrambled to find alternative sources and workarounds. The third country shell game. Some observers noted with interest that despite China's restrictions, certain American companies seemed to be obtaining rare earths through what appeared to be creative logistics and unconventional supply routes. Reports began circulating that suggested the United States was successfully circumventing Chinese controls by routing purchases through intermediary nations, countries that could import these materials from China and then re-export them to American buyers. Beijing's customs analysts and trade investigators weren't fooled for long. Through careful examination of international trade data, Chinese authorities identified two countries whose trade patterns had changed so dramatically that they practically announced their role as middlemen: Thailand and Mexico. The statistics revealed something extraordinary. Between December of the previous year and April, American imports of antimony oxide from these two countries alone totaled an astounding 3,834 tons. To put that in perspective, this single 5-month period saw import volumes nearly matching the combined total from the previous 3 years. The surge wasn't just notable, it was impossible to explain through normal market dynamics. What made this even more suspicious was that neither Thailand nor Mexico had previously been significant players in the antimony trade with the United States. Yet suddenly, immediately following China's export restrictions, both countries rocketed into the top 3 sources of American antimony imports. The timing was far too convenient to be coincidental. Economic analysis revealed another critical flaw in this supposed new supply chain. Neither Thailand nor Mexico possessed industrial bases that would require anywhere near these quantities of rare earth materials for domestic use. Consider Mexico's antimony production infrastructure. The country has exactly one antimony smelting facility, and that plant had actually been shuttered for years before resuming operations in April, precisely when these mysterious exports to America began. Thailand's situation was equally telling. The country lacks comprehensive rare earth processing capabilities, meaning there's no logical reason it would need to import massive quantities of these materials. These glaring anomalies quickly captured Beijing's attention. Chinese investigators began piecing together the puzzle using customs records, shipping manifests, and logistics data. What they discovered confirmed their suspicions. Substantial volumes of antimony and other restricted materials were following a circuitous route from China to Thailand or Mexico, where they underwent minimal processing or simple repackaging before being shipped onward to American ports. The scheme was relatively straightforward, but required cooperation across borders. Chinese minerals would be exported to these intermediate countries under documentation showing legitimate local buyers. Once there, American companies or their agents would essentially rebrand the materials, create new paperwork showing Thailand or Mexico as the country of origin, and then ship them to the United States, effectively laundering the supply chain to circumvent Chinese export controls. While this transshipment strategy provided American companies with temporary access to desperately needed materials, it couldn't remain hidden indefinitely. In May, Beijing responded decisively. Chinese authorities issued a formal warning announcing that they had identified illegal schemes designed to evade export controls through third-country transshipment of critical minerals. The statement made clear that such practices would face strict enforcement action going forward. But Beijing didn't stop at warnings. The announcement outlined a comprehensive plan to close these loopholes. Media. Customs checkpoints with enhanced security, monitoring equipment at rare earth export facilities, enhanced monitoring of rare earth and critical mineral exports, increased investigations into potential smuggling operations, and most significantly, consequences for countries that continued serving as transshipment hubs. Chinese officials indicated they were prepared to implement countermeasures ranging from heightened scrutiny of exports to those nations all the way to direct economic sanctions if the practice continued. The message was unmistakable. If countries wanted to help the United States circumvent Chinese export controls, they would pay a price for that decision. Parallel to the transshipment investigation, another approach was underway: direct negotiation. By mid-June, American and Chinese officials had been engaged in intensive discussions aimed at finding a framework that could address both nations' concerns. The talks produced what both sides characterized as a preliminary understanding built on mutual concessions. China agreed to conditionally resume exports of certain civilian-grade rare earth materials, easing the supply crisis facing American manufacturers. In exchange, Washington would relax restrictions on exports of high-performance artificial intelligence chips to Chinese buyers. The chip issue had become particularly contentious in April when the United States government announced indefinite export controls specifically targeting NVIDIA's H20 processors destined for China. These weren't ordinary computer chips. They represented some of the most powerful AI computing hardware available on the global market, capable of the massive parallel processing required for training advanced artificial intelligence systems. For China, access to these chips represented a strategic necessity. Beijing has made artificial intelligence development a cornerstone of its long-term economic and technological strategy. Building and training large-scale AI models, the kind that power advanced language systems, autonomous vehicles, and next-generation manufacturing, requires computing infrastructure of extraordinary capability. Without access to cutting-edge processors like the H20, China's AI ambitions would face significant technical obstacles. Both sides recognized they had leverage over something the other desperately needed, creating the conditions for a bargain. The agreement reached in June allowed H20 chips to resume flowing to Chinese markets, while Beijing simultaneously accelerated its processing of rare earth export license applications that had been pending from American companies. The impact showed up quickly in trade statistics. June data revealed that China's exports of rare earth permanent magnets to the United States surged by that remarkable 660% figure, reaching 353 tons, marking the highest monthly total since the restrictions began. Now, 353 tons might sound modest, and in absolute terms it certainly was a fraction of typical pre-restriction volumes. But consider what that amount of rare earth material represents in practical applications. enough dysprosium and other critical elements to manufacture approximately 800 F-22 Raptor fighter jets, or alternatively, to produce electric motors for more than 230,000 electric vehicles. Even a small quantity of these materials translates into substantial industrial and military capability. With this initial shipment secured and the supply chain appearing to stabilize, there was cautious optimism that both sides had found a sustainable framework for managing their differences while meeting their respective economic and security needs. That optimism proved premature. Just weeks after American companies began receiving those restored rare earth supplies, Washington introduced a demand that Beijing viewed as changing the rules mid-game. On July 21st, the United States Treasury Secretary gave an interview that sent shockwaves through the delicate negotiations. While acknowledging that talks between the two nations were progressing and that both sides were implementing previously agreed-upon measures, he made clear that the Trump administration felt no urgency to finalize a comprehensive trade agreement with China. More importantly, he revealed that the upcoming third round of negotiations in Stockholm, Sweden, would expand beyond tariffs to address other issues. Chief among these new issues, an American demand that China immediately cease all crude oil imports from Russia and Iran. The Treasury Secretary didn't couch this as a request or suggestion. He explicitly warned that if China failed to stop importing oil from these two nations, it would trigger what he called 100% secondary tariff penalties, essentially doubling the already substantial tariff burden on Chinese goods entering American markets. He went further, suggesting that if the United States implemented such comprehensive secondary sanctions on China, European Union member states would likely adopt similar measures, creating a coordinated Western economic pressure campaign. To understand why Washington cares so deeply about China's oil purchases from Russia and Iran, we need to look at America's own energy situation and strategic objectives. The United States currently ranks as the world's third largest oil exporter, with domestic crude oil production averaging approximately 13 million barrels per day. That's an enormous output, enough to make America not just self-sufficient, but a major global supplier. However, there's a complicating factor. American refining capacity has actually declined by roughly 8% in recent years, creating a mismatch between how much crude oil the country produces and how much it can process domestically. This imbalance has created a logistical nightmare visible off Mexico's coastline. According to foreign media reports, more than 60 oil tankers carrying approximately 18 million barrels of fuel were anchored offshore, unable to unload their cargo due to insufficient storage capacity. These vessels sat idle for extended periods, accumulating substantial berthing fees and storage costs that ate into profit margins while their cargo remained stranded at sea. For American energy companies and the administration, the solution seemed obvious. Find buyers for this surplus crude oil. And the world's single largest crude oil buyer is China, which consumes approximately 700 million tons annually to fuel its massive industrial base and growing consumer economy. Yet despite America's surplus and China's enormous demand, trade data from the first half of the year showed something remarkable. China imported exactly 0 barrels of crude oil from the United States. Not a single tanker made that journey. Facing mounting pressure from energy companies dealing with inventory backlogs, the Trump administration repeatedly proposed that China begin purchasing American crude oil. For President Trump, the appeal went beyond just solving an immediate logistical problem. As a businessman turned politician, he saw an opportunity for a broader strategic deal. Chinese purchases of American oil could be leveraged to encourage Beijing to continue buying United States Treasury bonds, helping finance American government debt while simultaneously strengthening economic interdependence between the two nations. Washington's strategy also had a geopolitical dimension. By offering itself as an alternative energy supplier, The United States hoped to use oil exports as leverage on the Iran nuclear issue, while simultaneously weakening the increasingly robust energy partnership between China and Russia. The numbers told the story of that deepening Sino-Russian energy relationship. Chinese oil imports from Russia had increased by 45% in recent years, making Russia one of China's most important energy partners. American strategists calculated that if they could force China to stop importing oil from Russia and Iran, two countries facing extensive American sanctions, those sanctions would become significantly more effective. After all, China represents such enormous demand that its participation, or lack thereof, in purchasing sanctioned oil fundamentally determines whether those sanctions achieve their intended economic impact. China's reaction to Washington's oil ultimatum was essentially to ignore it entirely. Trade statistics from June painted a clear picture of China's priorities. That month, Chinese crude oil imports averaged approximately 12 million barrels per day, an enormous volume reflecting the country's energy needs. Of that total, roughly 2 million barrels per day came from Russia, while another million-plus barrels originated from Iran. There's an interesting detail about those Iranian imports. They don't appear in official statistics as Iranian oil exports to China, because technically, they aren't. Due to American sanctions that have targeted Iran's oil industry for years, China suspended direct crude oil transactions with Iran some time ago. Instead, the two countries engage in what trade specialists call entrepot trade, commerce conducted through intermediary parties. The mechanism works like this. Iranian oil is first shipped to countries such as Malaysia, where it's essentially given a new identity in the paperwork. It then enters China as crude oil originating from that third country, rather than from Iran directly. This allows both nations to maintain their economic relationship while technically avoiding direct violation of the sanctions framework. It's similar to the transshipment strategy American companies attempted with rare earths, except in reverse. Despite continued American pressure and increasingly explicit threats, Beijing has shown no indication of wavering on its energy partnerships with either Russia or Iran. The reasons go far beyond simple commercial convenience. They're rooted in formal strategic agreements that Beijing takes seriously. As early as 2021, China and Iran signed a comprehensive 25-year cooperation agreement estimated to be potentially worth up to $400 billion over its lifetime. This wasn't a casual memorandum of understanding. It was a detailed framework covering multiple sectors, with energy cooperation forming a central pillar. If China were to suddenly stop purchasing Iranian oil now, it wouldn't just be responding to American pressure, it would represent a direct breach of a formal bilateral agreement that both nations have treated as a cornerstone of their strategic relationship. For Beijing, that kind of reversal would damage its credibility with other nations and undermine its position as a reliable partner for countries seeking alternatives to Western-dominated economic structures. The Russian relationship carries similar weight. In May of this year, during a high-level summit between Chinese and Russian officials, the two nations signed more than 20 cooperation documents covering various economic and strategic sectors. Among the most significant commitments, Russia explicitly pledged to provide China with an unlimited supply of oil and natural gas resources. The specific terms are remarkable in their scope. According to the agreement, Russia will supply China with at least 45 million tons of oil annually for the next 25 years. The total value of this quarter-century energy partnership? Approximately $270 billion. That represents one of the largest bilateral energy agreements in history, binding the two nations together economically in ways that create shared interests and mutual dependency. Given these massive, long-term strategic commitments, both the $400 billion framework with Iran and the $270 billion arrangement with Russia, it's clear why Beijing views American demands to abandon these partnerships as completely unrealistic. whether motivated by honoring formal economic agreements, ensuring energy security for its vast industrial base, or maintaining its credibility as a strategic partner for nations outside the Western sphere, China is exceedingly unlikely to sacrifice its relationships with Russia and Iran simply to satisfy Washington's demands. The stakes are too high, the commitments too substantial, and the alternatives too costly. This brings us back to the American threat: 100% tariffs if China refuses to comply. Here's the reality that Washington may not want to acknowledge. Whether or not the United States actually implements such extreme tariff measures is, at this point, largely irrelevant to China's strategic calculus. Since the beginning of this year, the United States has already imposed substantial tariffs on numerous critical Chinese industries. The list reads like an inventory of China's most competitive export sectors: electric vehicles, solar panels, and photovoltaic equipment, semiconductors and related components, and various advanced manufacturing products. In many cases, Washington has essentially exhausted its options. It has already imposed every tariff it reasonably can on these sectors.